Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, a podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. My name is David Capes, and I am the Senior Research Fellow at the Lanier Theological Library and a former dean up there in Wheaton at the School of Biblical and Theological Studies. Our purpose in these podcasts is really very simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, so we can read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it, but to live it. Join me today on Exegetically Speaking is Dr. John Walton, Professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College. John, good to see you again.
Good to be with you again, David.
We're doing this by computer, 1,100 miles away. In the days of COVID, we hope next time face-to-face.
Indeed.
Everybody knows your work, I think, and knows that for you, context is everything. That's your phrase, I think. But we're going to talk about 4 different kinds of context and then dig down into the historical with Daniel chapter 7. Tell us about those 4.
Well, the first is linguistic context, which is what this podcast focuses most attention on. Linguistic context means that we have to understand the meanings of Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek words and understand them the way that they understood them. And sometimes translation is difficult to capture that. Sometimes we don't even have a word to translate the word that we know in the original language. So the meanings of the words and the way that they work together to accomplish meaning. The second context is a literary context, and that deals with primarily with genre, but also with rhetorical devices and structures and those kinds of intertextual things that are part of a literary work. The third is historical context, which we're going to focus on today, and that's our understanding of how what is taking place in history informs our interpretation. Many times the original audience is well aware of those events and we are less aware of them. So sometimes that takes some study.
Yeah.
And finally, the fourth is cultural context. And that helps us to think about how elements that are embedded in the culture are essential for understanding the full nuances of the text. Again, the cultural elements are things that the original audience understood well, but that we in our modern context don't always understand. Often we get tripped up with our own intuitive imposition of our foreign thinking that comes from our modern culture. So those are 4 different contexts.
And if you start with those assumptions, those are wrong assumptions, modern assumptions. And we have to really understand those ancient assumptions. So let's look at the historical today, and particularly in Daniel chapter 7.
Well, Daniel chapter 7 is interesting because it's the last chapter of the Aramaic section of the book. Daniel 1 is in Hebrew, Daniel 2 through 7 is in Aramaic, and then 8 through 12 hops back to Hebrew. So it's interesting because it's part of that section of Daniel. It's also interesting because it bookends that Aramaic section by the 4 kingdoms motif, which is in Daniel 2 with the dream statue, and now in Daniel 7 with the beasts from the sea. And so it plays an interesting role in the chapter. But the historical comment opens up the chapter. It tells us that this took place in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Now, of course, we know by now that Belshazzar was a co-regent with his father Nabonidus. Nabonidus was the father and officially the king of Babylon, but he had adopted Belshazzar as his co-regent while he went to Tamar in Arabia for 7+ years and never came back to Babylon during that time. And so Belshazzar sat on the throne. So we have that historical information, that setting given to us.
So how does that help us? Give us kind of a payoff there. How does that help us understand what's going on in chapter 7 a little bit better than if we didn't know that?
Sure. Well, Nabonidus came to the throne in 555 BC. So he came to the throne, and it was 2 or 3 years before he left and went to Tamar and installed Belshazzar. So we know that Belshazzar's first year was 553, 552. Okay, now again, we know that because of the Babylonian inscriptions that we have. And so we know when Nabonidus left, what he was doing, what his activities were. And so we have this historical information in their own inscriptions. That means Belshazzar begins in 553. Now, when we have that piece of information, now we can ask what's going on the world scene at that time.
Right.
And we find that that's the time when Cyrus begins making his move against the Medes in order to create what becomes the Medo-Persian Empire, one of the very kingdoms that Daniel 7 is going to talk about. So
because what happens in 7 is you have he has a vision of these beasts, right?
Exactly. The beasts which represent these 4 kingdoms.
Mm-hmm.
And the first beast is a lion with eagle's wings, and they're plucked, and he stands on his feet like a man, which reflects chapter 4 of Daniel with that dream. But now the second beast is ready to enter the scene. And that's what's important here. Daniel 7 picks up. Daniel 2 was introducing the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian kingdom. And now at this juncture, coming out of the Aramaic section of the book, it revisits the 4 kingdoms and picks it up right at the point where the second kingdom is beginning to take shape.
And Cyrus is such an important person in Isaiah and in other books as well. Isaiah 45 comes to mind, where he's called Mashiach, my Messiah, or my King, my anointed one, right?
Exactly. So in this sense, the historical background is essential for understanding the setting of the chapter. The dream statue was just about the first kingdom. I mean, it talked about all of them.
Yeah.
But it focused on the first kingdom. Now this begins focusing on the second kingdom.
Fascinating stuff. Dr. John Walton, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Sure. My pleasure.
Thanks to Silvio Vasquez, Rebecca Larson, and Krista Sanchez for helping us to produce this podcast. Thanks as well to Phil Keggy for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, the best place you could do that is Wheaton College. They have an amazing program. One of the best I've ever seen, whether you want to be a graduate or an undergraduate student. So go to the website, www.wheaton.edu, and look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Contact us at exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.